We're going to be frosting our little Halloween mummy today. And I'm going to be using the Frosting Artist base layer guides. These are now over at frostingartist.com, and they will help you to frost these base layers perfectly every time. You're still going to trace your shape just like always. And then apply a nice even pressure all the way through. I was just trying to get rid of some of those little scratch marks that come from either some dry icing or some meringue powder that didn't fully dissolve. I just try to get most of them out of there. You don't have to worry about getting all of them because we are going to be covering this up with 2 more layers. By using these guides, you are able to get these layers to dry within about 4 to 5 minutes per layer. So it should only take about 15 minutes to create these bases, and then we can be frosting our design. I'll let this dry fully while I clean my tools, and then we'll frost that second layer. It's been about 4 minutes, and our layer is dry, so I'm going to be adding our next layer. That's going to be your same stencil here. Just make sure that it kind of snaps into place along the outline of the previous layer. And I put this frame down to lift that stencil up, and then we're going to sandwich it between this other frame. That way we can get that perfect thickness. If you don't have the base layer guides, you can get them at frostingartist.com, or you can do it without them. You just have to make sure that you hold your scraper at a 45-degree angle and you keep it as level with the table as you can. With these frames, you are able to let your scraper ride on the frames and just apply a nice even pressure all the way across. And you don't need to push too hard. You still want to make sure that your whole scraper is riding flat along those frames. If you were to be frosting more of these than just the one, you could pinch all of these in the corner up here where the stencil is, peel it up, and immediately move on to your next topper. We're going to let this dry while I clean my tools, and then we'll be right back to frost that third and final layer. For your third and final layer, we're going to be frosting this black. Make sure that you stack 2 frames this time, and then sandwich that stencil between that last third frame. This black is going to act as the background, but also this design is kind of cartoon style, and so it does have the black outline around the rest of the colors. So this is going to act as that black outline as well. And that is the final time that we will be frosting this base layer. So once you clean this stencil, you can set it aside, and then we'll continue with the rest of our design. This first layer is always going to be the most detailed layer that we have, just because it's the layer that everything else builds off of. So it's going to have every single detail of your design throughout here. The only spot that you really probably want to pay attention to is his eyebrow here, because it's only connected in this one spot. So that's your biggest free floating piece of plastic right there. And we want to kind of frost with these thinner lines as best as we can. So let's just start on the head, get this all centered where you want it, and as you can see, we're not using our frames anymore. From now on, we're just going to be layering our stencils on top of our nice flat base. Just let the weight of your hand and spatula swipe across to tack that eyebrow down, and then we're just going to keep following through in all these different areas to make sure that we are tacking down all of these little pieces of plastic. Once you get everything tacked down, you can come back through and kind of scrape off some of that excess icing. And I'm not pushing hard. Again, it's pretty much just the weight of the spatula and my hand doing all of the work. Now gently swipe across, and I like to do a couple of passes where I just let, again, the weight of my scraper in my hand just kind of scrape across and remove small amounts of icing at a time. That way I don't push any of that icing underneath those finer details. Once you can start seeing your design through the icing there, that's when you know that you have this thin enough, and then you can just peel it off. Anchor on one side and peel from the opposite. You can see that I did push under a little bit by his eye right here, so I'm just going to come through with a toothpick and scrape that out. The rest of these lines are perfect. I'm going to turn this fan on. It's only going to take a couple minutes for that to dry because it's so thin. It's a lot thinner than what we did our base layers as. So by the time I have my stencils and my spatula clean, it'll be ready for the next layer. So this blue was just for his face and his little eyelids. The rest of this is going to be getting covered up. The reason I layer my stencils this way is so that I'm never frosting next to another dried layer that's going to lift that stencil up and allow that icing to push underneath. That's how you achieve these really crisp results. I like to kind of press these thinner lines down into the grooves of the dried icing layer below. That way it kind of helps tack them into place, and it's less likely that your next layer of icing is going to push underneath at that point. Again, we tack down that eyebrow, and then we're going to come through and tack down everything else. You want to make sure that you have enough icing on your spatula to make it all the way across your design and you don't run out of icing halfway across. Because if you have any details in the middle there and you swipe across and run out of icing, you can push underneath those details, or if you have free-floating pieces of plastic, they can get shifted, and that's where you start getting those smudged lines. I just want to make sure that I'm getting a nice even layer across here, because this is going to be the wraps for our mummy. So I want to make sure that we don't have a lot of that blue shining through. So you do want to make this layer a little bit thicker, but at the same time, you don't want it too thick. So notice I keep scraping that hand a little bit too thin. That's why I keep going over it. There we go. And you're not going to be able to avoid seeing some of that blue shine through, but as we finish up this design, and especially once we peel off the stencil, you'll see that it's not shining through as much as it seems on this while you still have the stencil down. So once we peel this up, you'll see that you really can't see too much of that blue shining through. Let this dry fully while we clean our stencil and tools. Then we'll come in and we'll add some shading to the wraps before we finish up his face. For this next layer, we're just going to line these up, and this is going to create our shading. I'm going to kind of anchor down on the topper just because this stencil felt like it was going to shift a little bit. So once I get those spots tacked down, I can then anchor off to the side here. Scrape across at about a 45-degree angle until you can see your design. So it's nice and thin. And then peel up. So for this next layer, we're going to be doing dark brown. All three of our most recent colors that we've done, this lighter cream color to our shadow and now to this brown, were all made using black, yellow, and red, with just different amounts of each. So I was able to create this first lighter color, and then for the shadowing, I just added more brown and a little bit more red. And now for this dark, dark brown, I just added more black and red. And then the last stencil we have will be the white for the eyes, and then we'll be done with this design. It's now time to detach this from our piece of plastic so we can attach it to our cookie. Just flip over your plastic and carefully peel it away from the back. And now your topper is ready to put on your cookie. And you can see that these are fairly thin, so they don't really add too hard of a bite. Once you get that fresh icing underneath, you'll have a little bit of a crunch, but then the nice soft icing underneath. And I go through and I just make sure to trace the outside of my cookie. And you don't have to be doing this perfect because we're going to be covering it with this topper. And then I just kind of squiggle some icing in the middle. And this icing will kind of push out once we put this topper on and kind of press down on it. So you don't have to worry about completely flooding your cookie. And this icing consistency is about the same, maybe slightly runnier than what I stencil with. So it's not a flood consistency. It's a little bit more of a solid, thicker icing consistency. And you can experiment with attaching these to the cookies to find what works best for you. And you do have quite a while to be able to shift these around on your cookie before they harden and get stuck in place. So you're able to shift them and get them lined up how you want them. And I'm just wiping off this excess icing. And that just kind of makes it have a nice sharp finish. I have piped borders around these as well. That also looks really nice. And any of these areas that you can't get your finger in, you can come through with a toothpick and just wipe it clean. I think on this one I did make this icing a little bit more on the runny side than I normally do, so it is bleeding out from underneath the topper a little bit more than usual, but it will still work. You can pop these into a dehydrator for about 10 minutes just to help solidify that wet icing a little bit quicker. Or you can let them air dry. Just don't package them up for a few hours, at least 4. I usually let them sit overnight though, just to be on the safe side. And there is our cookie.